Thank you, everyone. Welcome to another virtual workshop hosted by the Albright Institute in Jerusalem. I'm the director of the Institute, Matthew Adams, and I'll be your MC for today. A few notes about upcoming dates of importance for the Albright. November 1st, we have two things happening. First of all, if you're planning to apply for an Albright Fellowship, that is the new deadline. So please check out our website and get your applications in. We'll also be hosting another virtual workshop on November 1st as well. This will be presenting a new book, Jerusalem in Roman and Byzantine Times, which was recently published, edited by Katerina Hayden and Maria Lissick. So if you're interested in that, watch your email inboxes. We'll be sending out the advertisements, should be today or tomorrow, with the appropriate Zoom links for registration. We have a great show for you today with four outstanding scholars ready to talk about the new book. I also have that here, The Middle Maccabees, Archaeology, History, and the Rise of the Hasmonean Kingdom, published this year by SBL Press. The editors of the book are here with us today. Andrea Berlin, she is the James Wiseman Chair in Classical Archaeology in the Department of Archaeology at Boston University and longtime friend of the Albright Institute. The other editor is Paul Kosmin. He's the Philip King Professor of Ancient History in the Department of Classics at Harvard University. We're also very excited to have with us two other great scholars who will be commenting on the book as well. Jodi Magness, she's the Keenan Distinguished Professor for Teaching Excellence in Early Judaism in the Department of Religious Studies of UNC Chapel Hill, and Boris Chrubasik, Associate Professor of Historical Studies and Classical Civilization at the University of Toronto. We'll be starting today with some pre-submitted questions for the editors, which we put into kind of a logical flow. We'll get some of their responses directly from Andrea and Paul, and then we'll follow up with some prepared remarks from Jodi and Boris. This book focuses on a narrow window of time, essentially the second half of the 2nd century BC, focusing on the formation of the Hasmonean state in the power vacuum resulting from the wars between Ptolemaic Egypt and Seleucid Syria. It brings together the work of archaeologists and historians, but it's not merely a compilation of independent studies. Rather, it's the result of a long-term and ongoing dialogue and collaboration by dozens of scholars. In many ways, however, the inception point is your excavation at Kadesh, Andrea, in northern Galilee, with Sharon Herbert. Andrea, can you tell us a little bit about that origin story?
Yeah, sure. Sharon Herbert and I went to start excavating at Tal Kadesh in 1997. We had a notion that we would like to excavate a small village on the border between the territories of Phoenicia and what was traditionally part of Israel writ large, so the Hasmonean state. And we were interested in the material correlates of ethnic identity. We ended up discovering a 2,000 square meter administrative building that had been constructed around 500 BCE and very abruptly abandoned in the middle of the 2nd century BC. We found whole vessels laying on floors. It was clear that people had left in a hurry from this site. I could date the pottery to the middle of the 2nd century BC, so I knew something big happened right around then. And in fact, very readily, we put our hands on the likely culprit, which was this short mention in the book of 1 Maccabees, chapter 11, about a battle that took place at Kadesh between the Seleucids and the generals of Demetrius and Jonathan, the younger brother of Judas Maccabee. And this reference in 1 Maccabees both explained what we found and completely confused us, because it provided a date and an event, but nothing that we found, and we found lots of other things in the archaeology that suggested that there were other players implicated in this story. Nothing that we found was represented in the text. And aspects of the text just didn't seem to describe very well the situation we found. And I didn't know what to do with that. I just didn't know what to do with that. So I looked for help. And when an archaeologist can't understand a text, that archaeologist tends to go to an historian for help. And that's what I did.
Great. So you went to an historian, and this first historian was Paul?
It was.
That's great. And why did you feel the need to get historians involved? I mean, obviously you were dealing with a text that you saw had problems. What did an historian bring to the table that you didn't have?
I didn't presume that the text had problems, and I didn't presume that the archaeology had problems. I just couldn't figure out how they went together. And I couldn't figure out how to situate. So I could have just left it. I mean, actually, historically, that's often what happens when archaeologists find a particular reference in a text. They're like, okay, I found the explanation for what I found here in this one phrase, in this one fragment. Good, I'm done. But I wanted to understand a bigger picture, and I had two sets of evidence that just hit off of each other instead of blending. And I needed programmatic help. I needed methodological help. I did not have the skills to understand what to do with this text.
Paul, what did you think when Andrea came to you with this interesting challenge?
I was enormously enthusiastic and excited by this project. Andrea had arranged for me to go and visit the Kiddush site at some point, and it's a really thrilling place. I'm interested in sort of Seleucid history and in the Hellenistic history of the East Mediterranean, and I was especially enthusiastic to work with Andrea because we'd already done a previous project together from a different part of Seleucid history. I've in fact got the book, I'm going to wave in front of the camera here, from our first project, which was on the city of Sardis in Western Anatolia, where we'd focused in a similar way to this project on bringing together historians and archaeologists to look at the Seleucid Empire at its height, at its 3rd century BCE height. And we'd worked well together. There were evident benefits of getting archaeologists, historians, numismatists, every kind of discipline together. And what the site of Kedesh and then the wider issue of sort of the Maccabean revolt and the expansion of the kingdom provides is a really well-documented problem, example of the decline of the Seleucid kingdom. Different kinds of issues. The southern Levant is amazingly well attested in terms of sort of 2nd century history compared to any other part of the Seleucid Empire. Primarily the text of 1st Maccabees, which Andrea talked about, but a bunch of other inscriptions, some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then a kind of highly granular archaeology, which allows us to ask questions in a kind of detail that we can't anywhere else in the kingdom. And it's also one example of a number of sort of independence, autonomy, new kingdom movements that result in new kingdoms as the Seleucid Empire is shrinking down. So I guess I was excited to work with Andrea for 2 main reasons. One, because it's Andrea, and we've cooperated very well together, and she's an amazing archaeologist and thinks really sympathetically with historians, and then also just the evidence itself.
This led then to essentially a 2-year seminar at Boston University. Was that part of the plan to begin with, or as soon as you guys started talking, this kind of evolved naturally, either of you?
I think we thought all along of this initially. We did not think of a book. We did not know what the story was. So we really did think of it as a project. That is, we were just exploring. And just as Paul said, there are lots of historical documents, lots of historical evidence about this period. There's a lot of archaeological evidence. Archaeology moves so fast. I mean, those of us in the field, Matt and Jodi, you guys know this. Archaeology moves so fast, it is hard to keep up. And one of the things that I knew was that there's new stuff out there that could be relevant and could shed light. We just started to want to collect things. So we inaugurated this ongoing dialogue. We're very lucky. We both live in Boston. We teach so close to each other that you can just a bike ride away. And so we started to have these couple of times a semester, what we called virtual brown bags. This was way before COVID. We were just inviting people from Israel or from England or from France who had some nugget of something relevant to something about the Maccabees, just to come and talk to us, and then we would ask questions. So for 2 years, we just had what I think could be characterized as a series of dialogues. And we were, I don't know, sort of in search of the story.
Neither of us knew what the end goal would be. And only gradually, as we heard from more and more archaeologists, kind of pattern began to emerge.
Right.
That meant having a conference and putting this together systematically, we thought would be really worthwhile. And that's eventually what we did just outside Milan. Which was the kind of the conference that produced this volume.
Yeah, looking at the participants throughout all of these initiatives that you had, just the sheer number of people and the number of people who wrote for your book, it seems like you stumbled onto a gold mine where you realize that, oh, there's tons of people working on this right now, and they're mostly just not talking together.
Yeah, that's exactly right. At some point, I can't even remember the chronology now. I mean, I just want to say that one moral of this story is that a great idea doesn't spring like Athena from the head of Zeus, and it takes time, and there's just a lot you can't see until you get close to the end. But there was a point, just as Paul said, where we began to see, oh, wait, there is a weird coincidence of a lot of archaeological evidence honing in on the exact same moment in time of abrupt abandonment that we had found at Kadesh, at site after site after site after site, in region after region in Israel. And nobody knew it because, I don't know, archaeologists are busy they're looking down most of the time. I mean, that's where we find things. And so people hadn't been aware. So there was a point, Matt, you might remember better than me what year it was, but there was a point where I had an Albright. I had to leave. It was a sabbatical year. I had 6 months in Israel.
Yeah, 2018, I think.
2018. And I thought, maybe I'm in Israel, maybe we can get all the archaeologists together. Most of the archaeologists working on this were Israelis, and so they were there. And they themselves had not realized how much of this was coming together until we got them all in a room at the Albright, and person after person stood up and said, oh, wow, what you just described for the southern coastal plain, that happens in the Shvela. Oh, wow, what you just described for there, that happens in the lower Galilee. Oh, wow, 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 wow. That's what happened then.
And I would just add that ancient historians had absolutely no idea that these developments were happening and that this data was out there. But it sort of, it made an intervention in exactly the kind of conversations we were having about the late Seleucid state and the characteristics of Hasmonean leadership and the degree to which Hasmoneans were integrated into Seleucid state structures.
So looking back at these initial virtual seminars in Boston, a lot is made about historians as a discipline and archaeologists as a discipline, often kind of stumbling over each other, sometimes fighting, sometimes working well together. What was it like in those early days when you realized that historical evidence and the archaeological evidence was kind of coming together in an interesting way? Was this a messy phenomenon from a disciplinary point of view, or did things work out easy?
Paul, you should answer that question first.
Sure. So I just think the historians in the room were sort of wide-eyed with wonder and excitement at the data we were we were being given. There was no sort of tension or sort of disciplinary fist fighting at all. And to kind of take a step back, I think, I'd also sort of question the distinction made between archaeological material and historical material. The archaeological material is historical data, and just like the text, and it's available to be used, embraced, manipulated, combined into new patterns by the historian.
Continuing with that theme of history and archaeology, especially those who are working in the Bronze Age, but it's of course no different in the Iron Age, sorry, no different for you as well. There's always this tension between archaeology and text. And I think the goals of both historians and archaeologists are essentially the same. They're just going about it in different ways with a different tool set. So I think it makes sense that everybody works together. Would you say that the goals are essentially the same for both fields?
Shall I have a go, Andrea, or do you want to?
Yeah, you start.
I mean, from my perspective, sort of thinking methodologically, archaeology and history are sort of not quite equivalent as categories. I'm trained in sort of Greek history, and so come at a world which is configured very differently to sort of biblical studies, biblical archaeology, Southern Levantine. But I think, resist very much the assumption that archaeologists deal with stuff in the ground and historians deal with texts. In fact, I'd frame it as perhaps sort of archaeology is primarily an engagement with the stuff in the ground. It's ways of analyzing the material traces that have happened to survive the launderings of time. And you have from the outside, you have this amazing kind of intimacy with particular types of material developed over sort of a closeness of studies, so in ceramics and coins, in Rhodian amphora stamps and the botanical remains, all the things that are in the book. Whereas I frame history not so much as based on a corpus of evidence, but as a way of asking questions, posing a problematic, and then drawing on all evidence that is germane to that problem, wherever it comes from, textual, material, climatic. So that's almost sort of history as almost like a parasitic discipline, which draws on the hard work of our archaeological and philological colleagues. For a topic like the late 2nd century Southern Levant, we do have a few new textual sources that appear from time to time, like the amazing Heliodorus stele from Maresha, now also attested in Beirut. But the sort of real fountain of youth is the archaeology. That's where the new data is coming out of the ground, and it requires a kind of real historical process and joining together. So in part, I'd say it's probably a sort of distinction of new matter coming out of the archaeology, a new manner of interpretation coming from the historians. But I expect Andrea will completely disagree with what I said.
No, not at all. I don't disagree. I don't disagree at all. I think that's exactly right. And I think that so for me as an archaeologist, what I get from collaborating with and aspiring to think more like historians is a bigger stage, which is much more crowded, with more characters and more points of view and more complexity. It's a funny, practically ironic thing, I almost think, because we think as archaeologists, we find the evidence of people, and we do. We find their things, but we don't have their names for the most part. We don't have their social location for the most part. That's something we reconstruct from their things. So then we cannot then say that that's some kind of factoid because it's based on our reasoning. So then it would be a circular argument. And so there's so many things that we think of as necessary to really understanding the wheel of time and the intersection of events and characters and agendas that archaeology on its own, the material evidence on its own, can not answer. And I think two things about the text. One, I have learned from Paul and from Boris and from other great friends of mine who are historians. Benedict Eckert is another. I have learned to take seriously the point of view of agenda, where one should start by asking what's the agenda. As an archaeologist, we never need to ask that. Nobody had an agenda when they left a cooking pot on the ground. We just get to find it and identify where it comes from, and that's the end of it. So the complexity factor really expands our ability to ask better questions about what we find.
And if I can just leap in here to follow up, the relationship is absolutely not one way, because the historians, at least I think I don't want to speak for the discipline. We benefited enormously from this collaboration. I would say two ways primarily. The first is historians tend to be kind of solo workers. We sit alone with our books and our materials in our office. Whereas archaeologists, I've only done one season of excavation at Sardis when I was a grad student, and it was a lot of time with a lot of other people in a small space. I think that there's a certain amount of perhaps sort of character selection that goes into archaeologists, but there is also built into the discipline a commitment to collaboration and a recognition of what can be achieved by lots of people working together, which just isn't really the case in the sort of current sort of model of the historian as it exists. And the other thing, sort of maybe more substantial thing, is a close dealing with and taking seriously the archaeological evidence tempers some of the increasingly dominant tendencies of ancient history right now. The burgeoning field of macro history, so that's both geographically and temporally extensive, the swift jump into a social studies style model building, comparative work. The archaeology slows everything down. It slows down the tempo, it reduces the scale, it's much more sensitive to sort of settings, textures, mechanics, variety, location. It's, not sure how to phrase it. I suppose it teaches a sort of patience and humility before the evidence, simply because the evidence is changing so much, so quickly. And I think the kind of collaborative chapter that Andrea and I wrote towards the end of the book, where you can, the chapter that was shared with everyone, where you can, in a sense, reconstruct the history of these pivot years, almost year by year, because the archaeological evidence for this period happens to be, coins and Rhodian amphora stamps that are really easy to date. Well, it's an extraordinary amount of work that has gone into it, but it allows us to have a sort of fine granulation, means that it's one of those very rare occasions when the archaeological evidence and the historical evidence can kind of speak the same language.
Speaking of this final collaborative chapter that everyone who registered had access to, this is the two of you taking all of this data that you helped bring together from all of these different participants. When you guys actually sat down to write this particular paper, how easy was it for you guys to write together from your historical and archaeological point of views?
I feel like it was pretty Paul, am I misremembering? I have a very rosy memory. Everybody who is my friend knows this. I only remember things nicely.
It was great. It was only great.
I feel like it was very, so first of all, we had been talking about this, not exactly nonstop, but a lot for 5 years. And we had this amazing conference in Milan. Happily, Boris and a whole squad of brilliant historians came there, and we literally gabbed at each other for a week. So it was mostly transcribing things that much of which was in our head when we finally sat down, and it felt great because all the things that we have been talking about, and I see there's a question in the chat about what is the distinction, not really between history and archaeology, but between literary studies and archaeology, meaning Greg, who I guess by which you mean literary studies and material remains. So words and things, right? And maybe that's what you mean. And yes, they are cognitively different, and they are, they are mentally and emotionally different. What Paul said about the sensory auras of archaeology, we feel those. So Paul and I have developed, I think, a very robust way to merge those different cognitive patterns. And it was really fun to be able to put it in words.
Okay, before we ask our guests to make a few comments, just a little bit of a fun question for both of you. If you could take this interdisciplinary model that you did for this particular period, what period would you love to see tackled next from the same point of view? Paul?
That's a good question. I'm going to nominate Andrea to answer first.
Well, I have an answer to that question. I do, and I will share it, but I just want to say that there are so many possible answers to this. I mean, I really hope I do. I really hope that this approach can be a model for more historians and archaeologists. I mean, obviously, Paul and I work in the same era, the Hellenistic period, and same zone, the Eastern Mediterranean, the sphere of these kingdoms, and it feels like an extremely deep and rich and robust zone where there are lots of areas that would be receptive to inquiry like this. And I really would hope that other archaeologists and historians take on this approach. Me personally, I confess that the literally next chapter of the story, so not the Middle Maccabees, but what I think of now, what I've now started to think of as the late Maccabees, from Janaeus to Pompey, or to Antigonus, really, from Janaeus to Antigonus, is ripe for this. I know it's ripe for this. I know that just as there was with Middle Maccabees, we have so much archaeology that has not been connected. It's not been collated. And I'm confident in my field, and I'm sure that if we put all the archaeologists in a room and had them share, and we had historians listening in, sparks would fly, and we could get started on the next book right away. I'm not saying we're going to do it, Paul. Don't worry. I'm just saying.
No, I think it's really thrilling. I mean, it's a great question, Matt, because ideally it would be a possible methodology to apply everywhere. You could just, get archaeologists and historians to look at any part of the ancient world together, but it in fact requires a particular configuration of the evidence. It requires you to have enough written sources, epigraphic sources, of whatever kind, to actually have the kind of historical narratives that can play well with extensive archaeology. So I think the next chapter of sort of the late Maccabees would be amazingly exciting, and something that I'd be really, really excited by as well is to look at the Seleucids in southern Mesopotamia, where you have incredible evidence, a bunch of both sort of classical Greek sources, but tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets, and an incredible archaeology. Obviously, the conditions are not really very safe right now to carry that out, but at some point, I could imagine that would be an equally exciting kind of coming together of the disciplines.
It sounds like the core of the method that we've been using this term method, but really it's just leadership. The two of you forcing people to come together over and over and over again, right? That's what really happened here.
Boris, did you feel forced?
Just the herding of the cats, I guess, rather than forced.
With archaeologists, it was definitely like that, but there was food involved, so they came willingly.
Excellent. Okay, thank you for that. I'd now like to turn to Jodi Magness to say a few words about the book. Jodi?
All right, thank you. Okay, here I go. This impressive volume brings into dialogue different types of evidence, archaeological, literary, historical, and different perspectives, broad views versus detail-oriented, to present a synthetic and compelling picture of the period from circa 160 to 104 BCE. I know this project was a monumental task, many years in the making, and I congratulate the editors and contributors for this achievement. Although I am honored by the invitation to speak, I am not a specialist on the Hellenistic/Hasmonean period, as I reminded Andrea when she contacted me. And I have to say I'm a little embarrassed here because I know that there are many people on the Zoom who are far more experts in this than I am, so please forgive me. I hope you will take this into account as I offer these comments, which reflect my own limited knowledge and personal interests. I begin with Galilee. As Uzi Liebner notes, the ethnic and religious identity of the Galilean population prior to the time of Jesus has been the subject of intense scholarly debate. When and how did Galilee become Jewish? When did different parts of Galilee come under Hasmonean control? And when did the Hasmoneans indeed forcibly convert the Itaurians and other populations to Judaism? Several Hellenistic sites in Galilee show signs of destruction and subsequent abandonment around 145 BCE, which may be plausibly connected with Jonathan's campaign. And those sites are Beit Yarach/Philoteria, Khirbet el-Eka, and Tel Kedesh. Whereas the destruction levels at other Galilean sites, especially in the Akko-Ptolemais area, might be the result of the struggles between contenders to the Seleucid throne and between the Seleucids and Ptolemies. Either way, following a period of abandonment, some sites were resettled or new sites were established nearby, apparently by Judeans. For example, after the destruction and abandonment of Hellenistic Khirbet el-Eka and Khirbet el-Eta, the Jewish village of Kfar Chitaya, Chitin, was established nearby. Karm Eras was destroyed in the mid-2nd century and abandoned briefly before being occupied by a new population that apparently was Judean. This evidence suggests that Galilee came to be Jewish through the settlement or colonization of Judeans, or as Liebner calls it, ethnic replacement, rather than through the large-scale conversion of native populations. However, a closer look at the other sites cited by Liebner, which were destroyed in the mid-2nd century and then abandoned, complicates this picture. Specifically, Tel Shimron, there's an abandonment gap and resettlement by a Jewish population in the early Roman period. Kiryat Ata, abandonment gap and resettled by a Jewish population in the late 1st century BCE. Kiryat Tamra, abandonment gap and only a small part of the site resettled in the Roman period. Khirbet Kinia, abandoned and not resettled. Tel Kesan, abandoned and not resettled. Meitzat Ateret and Khirbet Shuhara each have 2 Hellenistic destruction levels. In other words, these sites either were resettled only at the end of the Hasmonean period or in the early Roman period, or were not resettled at all. Therefore, in these cases, one cannot refer to a process of Hasmonean settlement or colonization or replacement. Of course, one problem is the lack of resolution provided by the archaeological evidence, specifically the imprecise dating of local ceramic types, especially at sites with few or no imported amphoras and fine wares, and the overlay of later remains. And as Liebner notes, quote, many sites are attributed to the Hasmonean period solely on the basis of Hasmonean coins, end of quote. But even if we agree that coins correlate with the presence of distinct ethnic or religious populations, they only provide a terminus postquem, and therefore would not necessarily indicate the beginning date of occupation. Although the archaeological evidence presented in this volume is a major contribution to our understanding of Hellenistic and Hasmonean period settlements, in my opinion, it hardly resolves the fundamental question of the origins of the Jewish population of Galilee before the time of Jesus. This undoubtedly will continue to be a matter of scholarly debate as more data are published from archaeological excavations and surveys. And now I'd like to turn briefly to sectarianism. In their synthesis of the results of the papers in this volume, Berlin and Paul Kosmin remark, quote, the archaeological remains of circa 145-144 to 138-137 BCE provide remarkable testimony of ferocity and flight, physical traces of where and when conflict came to ground. The fallout of the Second Syrian War stands out from the earlier conflicts for the extent of its dislocation. The archaeological evidence of widespread devastation is supported by the pattern of coin hoards, end of quote. Although, as Jutta Jokiranta notes, scholars disagree about when and why Jewish sectarianism developed, isn't merely a coincidence that the archaeological evidence of severe disruptions corresponds to Josephus's assignment of the emergence of the sects to precisely this period. Indeed, over 2 decades ago, Albert Baumgarten connected the turbulent events of this period to the development of sectarianism. Quote, on this interpretation, Maccabean victory, coupled with Jonathan's acceptance of the high priesthood from the Seleucid pretender Alexander Balas, was the first step in a series of accommodations with the foreign culture, which was to provoke the flourishing of ancient Jewish sectarianism, end of quote. Similarly, Hanan Eshel factions were solidified in Judaism's assumption of the high priesthood, witnessed the solidification of the sects, even if the process of formation had begun earlier. Although the central and southern interior parts of the country appear to have been largely spared from destruction, it would be interesting to consider whether the widespread dislocations and devastation around 145 to 137 were a factor in the intensifying sectarianism among the Jewish population. And now my last point concerns the Jerusalem temple. On page 258, note 2, Sylvie Honigman says, quote, actually, there are reasons to doubt that Judas Maccabeus reconquered Jerusalem and rebuilt the temple at all, end of quote. Citing John Ma's proposal that, quote, the temple was retrieved not through direct reconquest by the Maccabees, but through peaceful negotiations between Antiochus V and Menelaus. Ma contends that shortly after Antiochus IV's death, Menelaus presented a petition to the governor Lysias asking for the restoration of the temple to the Judeans. Given the ideological importance of temple refoundation for establishing the legitimacy of a ruling dynasty in the Judean political tradition, the Hasmoneans could have appropriated the memory of the temple rededication, even if in actuality it had been performed by Menelaus, end of quote. Although Honigman's statement is embedded in a footnote, the possibility that the Maccabees did not reconquer Jerusalem and rebuild the temple merits further consideration, as it would turn our understanding of the revolt upside down. According to First Maccabees, Judah Maccabee not only purified the temple, but also, quote, fortified Mount Zion with high walls and strong towers all around to keep the Gentiles from coming and trampling them down as they had done before, end of quote. Joseph Patrick and Marcos Edelkop observed that, quote, it is rather more reasonable that Judas Maccabeus's fortification project should be conceived as thickening and rising further up the walls of the porticos that had surrounded the precinct or replacing the porticos by a fortification wall, end of quote. They argue convincingly that the Temple Mount had no fortifications before the time of Judah Maccabee, aside from the Azara wall around the sacred precinct. According to First Maccabees and Josephus, after the battle at Beit Zachariah, Lysias and Antiochus V pursued the Jewish fighters to Jerusalem and besieged them in the temple. Betzalel Bar Kokhba has shown that the battle at Beit Zachariah took place at the end of May 162 BCE, and the siege of the temple started immediately thereafter and probably lasted no more than a month or two. The siege ended when the Jews accepted terms of surrender, which included the cancellation of Antiochus IV's decree, quote, on these conditions, the Jews evacuated the stronghold, but when the king entered Mount Zion and saw what a strong fortress the place was, he broke the oath he had sworn and gave orders to tear down the wall all around. That's from First Maccabees. Approximately a decade later, 152 BCE, Jonathan rebuilt Jerusalem, including the Temple Mount's fortifications, and I quote from First Maccabees, and Jonathan took up residence in Jerusalem and began to rebuild and restore the city. He directed those who were doing the work to build the walls and encircle Mount Zion with squared stones for better fortification, and they did so. Honigman's scenario would mean that after Antiochus IV died at the end of 164 BCE, presumably in 162 or 163, Menelaus was responsible not only for restoring and cleansing the temple, but for fortifying the Temple Mount. The fortifications must have been completed by the time Jewish fighters took refuge there after the Battle of Beit Zachariah in 162. We would then have to assume that Lysias ordered the fortifications torn down only a year or so after he allowed their construction. This sequence seems much less plausible, if not downright impossible, than the usual understanding that Judah's cleansing of the temple included the construction of the fortifications, in which Jewish fighters took refuge after the Battle of Beit Zachariah, and which were then torn down on Lysias's orders following their evacuation. It seems to me the claim that Judah did not retake Jerusalem and rededicate the temple could be questioned on other grounds, and I am interested in whether other scholars consider it a likely possibility. I conclude by thanking the editors for inviting me to offer these comments and by congratulating them and the contributors for this great achievement. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Jodi. That was great. Andrea and Paul, you'll have a chance to reply after we hear from both, if you wish. For now, I would like to ask Boris to say a few words.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I should say that Jodi and I did not talk to one another. The reason why I say this will become apparent after I'm done. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak here today. And it's great to, I was going to say it's great to see everybody, but I only see the panelists, which is also very nice. But anyway, a book of 22 chapters filled to the brim with new data, its interpretation, or new approaches to well-known pieces of evidence. This volume is an incredible addition to the material, culture, and history of the region. It also has the potential to be of transformative impact on how we interpret the developments of the 2nd century Levant and questions for the Mediterranean world more broadly. There's a lot to think about, and the overall weight of the material is very impressive. At the same time, and this is also one of the strengths of the volume, that despite high quality analyses, or maybe because of them, some phenomena remain very puzzling, and I'm sure they'll engage us more further. My natural impulse would be to go down every rabbit hole, argue through every possible interpretation, and really reflect on data, its representation, and critically its interpretation. If I had my will, we would then all be sitting here in a room for the next 6 hours while I would query individual authors on their footnotes and marvel at the variety of material, but none of us actually would want this, myself included. So instead, what I would like to do is offer 2 avenues where I would say the volume could lead us and ponder about the consequences this might have. And these are first, the question about correlation, causation, and the question of agency. And secondly, the question of Judea within the Eastern Mediterranean. Allow me to come to my first observation, the question of causation, correlation, and the question of agency. The archaeology and material culture of the region speaks a strikingly unison language. In many regions around 145 to the early 130s, this is Jodi's copying here, we find incredible layers of destruction, abandonment, and violence. These episodes of destruction seem to be combined with periods of coin hoarding, offering us an overall image of instability, violence, and disposition, suffering. Our ancient literary narratives concerning the period, mainly 1 Maccabees, Josephus, and part of Justin's reimagination of Trogos, speak of many wars and many political players at hand. They also speak of the growing strength of the Hasmonean warlords. There seems to be a natural tendency to interpret the archaeological data through these big men narratives. This is by no means the phenomenon of scholarship on the Hellenistic Levant, right? Whenever large structural changes occur within the archaeological grid of Western Asia Minor, historians and archaeologists alike seek out big men, and at rare times women, who could be associated with these events, often because the expenses these changes require seem to be too large, too vast, to be associated without any of these large movers. And while it is likely to associate some of these drastic changes in the material record with either the Seleucids, Pretenders, the Ptolemies, or the Hasmoneans, there's just a lot going on, it might be worthwhile to pause on this immediate identification for especially 2 reasons. First, and this is almost a trivial point, can we be sure that what we see on the ground reflects our understanding of the historical record, right? Above these distraction layers, we see the evidence and material culture that looks markedly different. And this is now commenting on Jodi's second point. A lesser presence on Rhodian amphoras and different types of finewares. But one question is whether the relationship between the archaeology and the large-scale violence mentioned in our literary sources is one of causation. Yes, we have these large Seleucid wars, and this is what we see on the ground, as is naturally assumed, or just correlation. And this leads me to my second point. The material from this volume invites us to consider the value of individual agency. While the contributions carefully outline the entanglement of larger powers mentioned in our literary sources, Andrea, in her discussion of Kadesh, also reminds us not to forget about the Tyrian warlords and their specific interests, indicating that there were surely many other groups whose warrior narratives did not survive. Perhaps more importantly, however, rather than adding additional big players trapped in the big man narrative, we ought to consider whether many of these events have to be connected to larger powers at all. The violent destructions and the hoardings of coins speak of large-scale military events, but in these times of civil war, they may well have been, and here I use the words of Sylvie Honigmann, villages fighting against villages, farmsteads against farmsteads. Even 50 years before the time period the volume discusses, the Hepzibah dossier discusses marauding soldiers going through the countrysides who cannot be controlled by local warlords. It is at least conceivable that many of the destructions could be very, very local indeed. Tyrian villagers against their neighbors, Sumerians against Judeans, and Idumean locals against coastal farmers. The resulting archaeology would not necessarily look very different. A region of both large-scale military activities and orchestrated looting and small-scale violence. And this is what the scholarship of civil wars seems to suggest, that the most destructive and violent events seem to be very localized and very small-scale activities. And small-scale activities may also be part of what comes after these periods of violence. If we see Judean settlers in the Galilee, individual and local agency, individual families traveling north, may also be here on one level, one explanation that has not yet received full attention. The current volume is a necessary first step toward making sense of the big picture. And with the presentation of these vast amounts of material, therefore, it's arguably time to step beyond the political history of the region and embrace the local social histories of those that made up the lives of the Hellenistic Levant. Jutta Jokiranta's emphasis on the fluidity of the community of Qumran, of the possibilities of community life that were not realized, is just one reminder of this. Our individual stories in the Levant, in the Galilee, in the Shvela, in Idumea and Samaria may also be quite different from one another, and that too is something to be embraced. Finally, I'd like to very briefly ponder about the role of the Levant in the study of the Eastern Mediterranean more broadly. The archaeology of Israel and Palestine has an incredible intensity, and the vast amounts of material are mind-boggling. The overall image of the 2nd century Levant then should ideally offer us comparative examples for other regions of the Mediterranean, right? Where we just have less archaeology to work with. And some contributions already anticipate this. Donald Ariel's reframing of the coins of Hyrcanus, for example, note Andy Meadows' article on the broader trends of the localization of coinage of the 2nd century Mediterranean. The use of non-Seleucid markers on these coins seems on the one hand a clearly conscious act, even if it occurs on bronze coinage. At the same time, if we place it in the context of localization of coinage, to which also silver coinage and Seleucid precious coinage seems to adhere to, that may mean that the Judean examples are part of a larger trend. On the one hand, telling us perhaps less about political choices than we might initially think, but also offering us a deeper insight into the connectedness of the Judean elite within the Eastern Mediterranean, if monetary trends in Judea reflect broader extra-regional patterns. More broadly, should we anticipate the violence and destructions we can see in the archaeological record also for other regions, such as the coastal regions of Western Asia Minor in the 3rd century? Politically, the region was at least as contested as 2nd century Judea, and we should perhaps also there expect many local and locally entangled actors. From first glance, Asia Minor does look quite different, and perhaps this is something one ought to reflect on. Is it about civil wars? Is it just about how archaeology was perceived? Can we see other regions where imports of Rhodian amphora were stopped after marked political changes? Back in the Levant, can we perhaps now, with access to all this material, similarly to recent approaches to the Roman conquest of Italy, ask the question to what degree questions of the environment had an impact on the growth of territory of the Hasmoneans controlled, again, stepping beyond the political. It seems, however, that the comparative examples also has some limitations. Danny Sion's careful demonstration of the small change in the Upper Galilee in the late 2nd century and 1st century BCE, and his figure 10.8, for example, is incredibly insightful. But I struggle to think of any other historical periods and areas where bronze coinage seems to function in a similar self-marking way. And that seems to be what's going on here. And that seems very striking and weird, perhaps inviting us to pause and reflect how exemplary the 2nd century Levant really is. Perhaps it should also make us rethink and analyze the specific forms of Hellenistic monarchy the Hasmoneans seem to espouse during this time. And I know I'm slipping into the political all the time. The volume is an invitation to do all these things. It's an impressive display of accessible archaeology and its broader contextualization. And it will encourage historians to delve more deeply into these important aspects in the history of the Levant. It'll encourage historians to transfer some of the insights to other regions and beyond of the Eastern Mediterranean. And it forces us to think how we think and how we write about the Hellenistic Levant. And I look forward to reading all about it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Boris and Jodi, for your comments. We have about 7 minutes left in our time here. Andrea, Paul, would you like to respond to anything that you've heard or make any further comments? Let's start with Andrea.
Jodi and Boris, thank you very much. The greatest accolade I think any of us can ask for is that something that we write makes you think in a different way and ask a different question. That it serves as a launch pad, it serves as a springboard, and I think I speak for Paul when I say that that is absolutely one of the things that we hoped this would do. We find so much. We are like the old astronomers who looked at the sky and drew constellations from the stars, right? They draw the pictures from all these stars, and we try to do that too. So sectarianism and its apparent contemporaneous evolution, now with this more focused understanding of what is happening, the Levant as either an exception or a model, whether on the ground or methodologically, these are great new avenues, and I feel like either one and all the others that you came up with would be, we could have another project.
Paul, would you like to add or subtract anything?
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Boris. Thank you, Jodi. Those were really insightful, important comments. And, you know, they point in many different directions. It's so tempting to respond to each one, but I will try and restrain myself. Just, I guess, just to say, yeah, the relationship between something like the pattern of destruction in this pivot moment and the emergence of sectarianism sort of characterizes the problem we have of trying to combine different bodies of evidence to explain phenomena that work in ways that are not always aligned with the pattern of evidence we have. So the emergence of sectarianism is obviously a massively complicated social phenomenon. And yes, you're absolutely, I do think it's highly likely that the experience, no doubt, extremely traumatic experience of the floor moving under you, of neighborly violence, as Boris says, of the kind of pole stars by which you've oriented your world disappearing is going to have a kind of spiritual and theological consequence. Boris's point about low-level neighborly violence is I think crucial, but I'd still be tempted to insist on the relationship between that and the big scale actors going on. It's I would almost describe that as a sort of, although it may be more felt on the ground, I'd be tempted to describe it more as an epiphenomenon of the wider geopolitics. But your points towards sort of local histories, the social histories, the environmental histories of late 2nd century southern Levant are crucial. There's been recent, really interesting work on changes of sea level along the Levantine coast, and precisely this moment with a sinking of certain harbor installations, things becoming, which is, I think, certainly going to become ever more evident. I would just want to close by thanking not only Boris and Jodi, but also all the contributors to this volume who have done really so much to illuminate this period for us, and who were such easy, willing participants in the process all the way through. And Matt, also thank you to you for hosting this wonderful event.
Okay, thank you, Paul, Andrea, Jodi, Boris. It was great talking and hearing from all of you today. For those of you who joined us as participants, thank you for listening. We had a great turnout. I'll leave the Zoom open for a couple of minutes so you can scroll back through the chat to find links to the book and other information that we posted there. Thank you again, Paul and Andrea, for this excellent work and for this really great example of scholarship. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Boris and Jodi.
Thank you. That was a lot of fun. Jodi and I, we should have written it together. Clearly, it fit together very well.
But I know that was kind of funny, actually.
And good too. Should I say?
Although you also pointed in different directions. It was, like Jodi, I sort of share your view on the role of Judas in the temple, basically. So sort of more aligned with our First Maccabee sources than Boris's view more generally. So I thought there was also, you aligned a lot, but there was also some different orientations.
John's view on 1 Maccabees, it's not mine. I'm quite neutral about it, to be honest.
No, I meant your more general points up, pointing away from that political.
Oh yeah, sorry, no, I think it's right.
I was just responding to Barnea Sullivan, who had put a question in the chat that we didn't get to about Jaffa.
Right.
And yeah, yeah. Hi, Barnea. And Ronnie Reich had also asked us a question about Gezer, and I just want to say that a big hole. I mean, it's a big book, 22 chapters. Thank you, Boris, for pointing it out. I'd already forgotten, but even so, there are significant gaps, and a big gap is the mid-coastal cities and their immediate hinterland. We didn't have an archaeological focus exactly on that point, and so it sort of fell in a gap. And I feel like it would be a great panel at ASOR or SBL or somewhere where we took this framework and then we honed in exactly on that area and said what was going on here. Yeah, very important. I mean, it's really important that major ports and their networks, very important. So Barnea, yes, we need to get to it. So I think this is done, and right, Matt, are we done? Matt, you're on mute.
You're muted.
Oh, yes, we're formally done, but that was an awesome informal encore, and I've got it all recorded. Like the people who stay for the credits of a movie and get a little teaser at the end.
Somebody there is commenting.
That was fun.
Okay, everybody, I better rescue my daughter from her engagement. So it's lovely to see you all. Hope to talk to you
again,
soon.
everybody.
Nice to meet you, Jodi. Nice to meet you, Matt.
Nice to meet you.
Boris, so great seeing you.
Take care,
I'm closing the
everybody.
Zoom.
Bye,
Good
you
afternoon.
guys.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Take care.